Hello everyone, welcome to our backyard TED Talk. To tell the story of Christmas, we still have to talk about the namesake, because you see even in Japan, which is not a Christian culture, they're starting to adopt these Western customs of having a Christmas tree and Santa, because it really has nothing to do with Christ. And you start to learn that none of it does. So I say that also with the understanding that every human, every family should have their own way of celebrating, but it's also really fun to understand where this stuff came from. So it's not to say whatever you do today is wrong. That is not the point. It is not to blame. It is to shed light on these cultures that actually were the inspiration for these things that we do. It's to say, let's look at these native cultures and understand what they were doing. These Siberian cultures or the pagan ones, the ones that came and inspired Christianity. So that's what we're going to look at right now. And if you don't want to go there, and if it's too triggering, just shut this off now, but I have to touch there. And if you're just even a little bit interested and it gets you to dig into your own roots, all the better. So I'm going to start the Christian story by saying Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism, right? We have the New Testament that was obviously new from something off of the Old Testament. That's like, you can't even deny there's a link to Judaism. We all know Jesus was a Jew, created in a context of a world where Egypt was in power. So when you look at the few thousand years right before the 0 AD time frame, we see Egypt was a major power. And we have to look at some of the lore and the mysteries that we see there. And we still call their religion mysteries or cults. And that's part of the language that's being used because of the last 100, 200, 500, 2,000 years of scientists that were very swayed by the church. So if you want a very unbiased view of this, start looking at what the Egyptian culture worshipped. And their major deity, their main god, was a solar god. It was called Ra, R-A or R-E. However we say it, we don't really know because there was a thread that was lost. And there was actually around that 0 AD time frame, Rome was starting to become a major power, and they didn't like the idea of Egypt having any credit at that point. And so there was a major rewrite in history from 0 to 500 AD, destroying of everything so that people wouldn't see this thread that inspired Christianity to life. The symbolism that you start to see in the Egyptian religion, they had the sun god, they had halos over themselves. Every king and queen had the word Mary in front because Mary meant holy. They had a cross. They had someone named Jesus. They had the body of Christ, which is a Eucharist, which is basically a symbol of the sun. There's this imagery there that you can't deny. They had Isis, the mother god that was virgin birth. Every day she woke up a virgin again. Nobody can understand why that is, but that's just what their stories say. And regardless of it, whether you believe it or not, we have enough history to say that the Egyptian religion had all of this symbolism at least several thousand years before the Jesus came into the picture. So that's all the context of when this 0 AD happened and Jesus existed. Egypt still had this magnificent lore and revere that people had for it. So we've got Egypt and many others, but that's the easiest thread to just follow in this story. We see that the crosses existed at least 6,000 years before Jesus Christ arrived. We see even versions of the story where the swastika itself was in one direction meant light and sun, and flipped the other way was night and darkness. The oldest story that we can find about what the cross could be was actually crossing sticks together to create fire. You see in many of these pagan, which basically just means not Christian, societies, they had a cross that they carried around. And it wasn't until way later that that started being a symbol of Christ. And you can find many different religions that have the birth of their Christ, and that word has been used thousands of years before the Jesus Christ person was around. But you see them born of a virgin birth on December 25th. And so it starts to become such a pattern that you read enough of these stories, it's, oh, okay, he's just another one of those figures. And whether or not any of these figures were real is not the point of the story. He may have existed. right? But we don't have any first account of that knowledge. All we know is that there have been inquisitions and book burnings and different things through different time periods where people have tried to rewrite the interpretations in a certain way. And now we're in this modern era, we can dig into that. And that's why it's so exciting. We have the freedom and the interest and the time to do that and to ask those questions. So we see all this stuff happening around 0 AD. Christ may have lived or died. This guy, JC, had a beautiful message, but there are no first-hand accounts. There's nothing of his in writing anymore. So everything that we have is someone that came after him. And we know he was not really a fan of the Roman government authority anyway. So the fact that he became a symbol of the Roman Empire is obviously a key to look a little deeper of what are they using him to say as opposed to what he said. And he was very loving, and that's really what I thought religion was when I was growing up, that it was a very accept everyone, and then you realize that's really not what is being told in the Bible at all. And that's the Roman version of the story. That's not necessarily what JC was saying. And there's probably a really beautiful metaphors to be seen when you read the Bible, but you have to go back to the original context to get a deeper story. So sure, you could read the version by someone who's translated, it was a misogynistic culture at the time. When you take an example like the story of Adam and Eve, there's a version that we read, this translation that says she was born of his rib. If you go to the original translation, there was no feminine and masculine delineation. It was, this person was born of this other person's rib. And we chose, as a Christian society, to put the label of she was born of him. It wasn't he born of her. It was a very specific thing. And same thing about Mary. She's been put through the ringer, told she was a prostitute, and then in the later 1960s, the church friend says, actually, there's really no evidence she was ever a prostitute. We're sorry we ever said that. And they said that very quietly. To know the rest of the context too, that there was a major fight for power around this time in 0 AD, and up until 600, 700,000 years later, they were fighting this imagery of the sun because that was really the original representation that people were looking at. There are so many first-hand accounts from the Pope writing how they were trying to change the symbolism away from being the sun and transfer that over to this Jesus Christ figure. So really we could fast forward to around 325 AD when we have Constantine, Emperor Constantine. And he was actually a member of, we could say, the Mithraic culture, but he believed in Sol Invictus. Mithra was a Persian god of light, and there were the elite in Rome were actually celebrating this in secret, this Mithraic religion that was, again, a solar god. We're finding it now. Every time people do renovations on these old churches, they find remnants of this previous culture in the basement. We see that everything was built on something that already existed. We could call it pagan, but it was really just some other religion that had the sun at the center of what they were doing and nature. So in 325 AD, this person that worshipped the sun his whole life until his deathbed basically changed the Christian narrative. And he said, okay, I have an army, I have this empire, I would like to start uniting everybody. And he actually sent his mom, who was around 70 or 80 years old at the time, and she went to existing sites that were already holy and started designating them for the church. Problem was, these places were already places people were doing pilgrimages. We see that they had mosaics on the floor that show this delicate, intricate history. When you actually go to Judea and Israel and you visit the churches, you see that their excavations, you learn that they are 26 layers of civilization deep. This is an area that was so deep in history, more than anyone has seen in anywhere else in the world. Just layer after layer of someone living there, someone else living there, 26 layers. That's as many as we found. And the more you look, the more you find. So Constantine was the first one to say, I had a vision of a cross, and so that's going to be our symbol from now on. And first of all, these people were all having visions. A lot of times you see that it was a vision under some kind of psychedelic. You see the burning bush in the Bible actually was most likely the acacia plant that has hallucinogenic features when you burn the holy smoke, had psychedelic properties. The holy anointed oil did as well. We see marijuana in a lot of these different recipes, and hemp, and so we understand that there is some psychedelic use even in religion. Visions that people were having, these miracles that they were seeing. But really, it was about getting people to convert to that religion. That maybe wouldn't be such a problem, except we start to really try to remove them from the narrative. And I think that's where I think we start going wrong, in the wrong direction. This emperor in 325 AD spent his whole life celebrating Sol Invictus, the sun. He instituted Sunday as the holiest day of the week, and we still have that today. And there was this compromise that the people in power at the time, the church, merged these two symbols so that we could get people that were already worshiping the sun to start understanding the Jesus Christ symbol as their sun.